The workshop smelled like sawdust and linseed oil and something underneath both of those things. Something older. Something that didn't have a name, but that I had been breathing since I was 4 years old, standing on a step stool beside my grandfather while he showed me how to hold a plane properly. Not gripping it, guiding it. There's a difference, he said, and he made me practice until my arms ached. My grandfather, Rémi, built that workshop with his own hands in the backyard of the house on Cartier Street in Trois-Rivières. He built the shelves, the workbench, the tool racks. He built the cabinet that held his chisels in descending order of size. He built everything in that room except the things he needed other tools to build first, and those he borrowed from a neighbor and returned the same afternoon. He was that kind of man. Precise, careful, deeply, quietly serious about the things he loved. He passed away when I was 26, in the February of a year that was already hard enough without that loss added to it. He left me the workshop. Not the house. The house went to my mother, his only child, but the workshop, its contents, and the small detached building it lived in, which sat at the back of the property on its own foundation, with its own door, with its own set of keys that he pressed into my palm at the hospital 2 days before he died and said, "Tu sais quoi faire avec ça?" You know what to do with this. I did know. I had always known. I was the one who spent every Saturday morning out there with him from the time I was old enough to be useful. I was the one who learned to identify wood by smell, to read grain direction with my fingertips, to understand that patience was not a virtue you practiced in a workshop. It was a requirement, the same way oxygen was a requirement. My mother loved her father, but she had no interest in woodworking. My aunts had moved away years earlier. There was no question, between the three of us, about who those keys belonged to. My husband Joel knew all of this. I told him on our third date, actually, because it came up naturally. We were walking past a lumber yard in the plateau, and I stopped without thinking and started talking about quarter-sawn white oak, and he laughed and said he'd never dated anyone who could identify wood by looking at the end grain. I told him about my grandfather, the workshop, the Saturday mornings. He listened the way some people listen when they're genuinely interested and not just waiting to speak. I remember thinking that was rare. We got married 2 years later. We moved into a rental in Longueuil together, close enough to Trois-Rivières that I could drive up on weekends when I wanted time in the workshop. Joel never came. He said it was my space, my thing, and he meant it kindly. I believed him when he said he understood what that workshop meant to me. That was not my first mistake. My first mistake was assuming understanding would hold up under pressure. His brother Cedric moved to Montreal about 18 months into our marriage. Cedric was 23, between jobs, between apartments, between what felt like most of the structures that usually hold a person's life in place. Joel was fond of his brother in the way older siblings sometimes are, a kind of loyalty that didn't always pause to evaluate what the loyalty was being offered in service of. Cedric needed a place to land. Joel wanted to help him. I understood both of those things, and I had no objection to helping Cedric within reason. What I didn't understand at first was how quickly helping Cedric became a project that expanded without asking my permission to expand. It started with Cedric crashing at our place for a week, which turned into 3 weeks, which turned into a quiet, unspoken recategorization of the living room couch as Cedric's territory. Then Joel started mentioning casually that Cedric was looking for a space to start a small business, a detailing business. He had the tools. Or he could get the tools. He just needed somewhere to work out of temporarily while he saved up for a proper unit. Joel said this to me over dinner one night, not quite looking at me, with the tone of someone who had already formed a conclusion and was sharing it after the fact. I asked him what space he had in mind. He said, "Your grandfather's workshop." I put my fork down. I said, "Joel." He said, "Just temporarily. I want to be clear about something because I think it matters. Joel is not a cruel person. He is not calculating or malicious. What he is, in certain situations, is someone who loves the people he loves so completely that the logistics of that love sometimes override his better judgment." He had convinced himself that because Cedric's need was genuine, the solution he'd arrived at was reasonable. He had not paused long enough to ask whether the thing he was offering belonged to him to offer. I told him, quietly and without anger, that the workshop was not available, that it was not a storage unit or a commercial space or a temporary fix. That my grandfather had left it to me for a reason, and that reason was not to be the first solution that came to hand when a family problem needed solving. Joel said he understood. He said he'd think of something else. 2 weeks later, his mother called. Her name is Genevieve, and she is a woman who approaches life the way a contractor approaches a renovation. She assesses the space, identifies what needs to change, and begins work before anyone has confirmed the budget or signed anything. She called me on a Tuesday afternoon, which was unusual, because she normally called Joel, and she opened the conversation with enough warmth that I should have been more alert. She asked how I was doing. She asked about my work. I'm a technical writer for a software company, fully remote, which meant I was home when she called. She asked whether Joel and I had been up to Trois-Rivières lately. I said yes, I'd been up the previous weekend to work on a cabinet I was making. She said that sounded wonderful, that Rémi had been such a talented man, that it was so beautiful the workshop had stayed in the family. And then she said, "So you're still using it regularly?" I said yes. She said, "Because Cedric is really in a difficult spot, you know. He's a good kid. He just needs a little help getting started. And it's not like the workshop is being used for anything commercial. It's just a hobby space, isn't it?" The word hobby landed like something dropped on purpose. I said, "It's not a hobby space. It's my grandfather's workshop. And it was left to me." She said she understood that, of course she did, but family helps family, doesn't it? She said that Joel had mentioned the workshop had more than enough room for 2 people to work side by side. She said Cedric was responsible. He would keep it clean, he would respect the tools, and of course this would only be for a few months while he found a proper unit. She said she hoped I could find it in my heart to be flexible. Every sentence was designed to make no sound like selfishness. I recognized the architecture of it. I had read enough about boundary violations to know what a soft coercion script sounded like, even when delivered in a warm voice, even when the person delivering it genuinely believed they were just asking for a favor. I told her I would think about it. I got off the phone and sat for a long time at my kitchen table. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't rage, it wasn't even clear hurt. What I felt was something more like the slow, settling certainty of a person who has just realized that a situation is not going to resolve itself and is now deciding what to do about it. I thought about my grandfather. I thought about the way he said my name when I got something right. "La, tu comprends. There you go, now you understand." I thought about the keys, which I kept on the same ring as my car keys, which I had been carrying every day for the past 3 years without thinking about it. The way you carry things that belong with you, without having to remind yourself that they do. And then I thought about what would happen to the workshop if I let it become Cedric's business space for just a few months. The automotive chemicals, the clients coming and going, the floor my grandfather had sealed himself with 3 coats of penetrating oil. The tools on the walls organized in a system I knew by heart. The cabinet with the chisels in descending order. No. The answer was no. The answer had always been no. The question was how to say it in a way that would actually be heard. The following Saturday, I drove up to Trois-Rivières. Not because anything had changed, but because I needed to be in that space. I needed to feel the weight of what I was protecting before I said the words out loud. I worked for most of the afternoon on the cabinet. Mortise and tenon joints, which my grandfather had taught me were the most honest joint in woodworking. No shortcuts, no forgiveness for imprecision, but extraordinarily strong when done right. I fitted each joint, I tested the fit. I took apart what didn't work and tried again. Before I locked up, I stood in the middle of the room for a moment and looked at everything. The light through the frosted window, the smell, the chisels in their cabinet, the plane my grandfather had bought at a flea market in 1987 and restored over the course of one winter. The step stool I had stood on when I was 4, still tucked under the workbench. I locked the door, I put the keys in my pocket, I drove home. The following Thursday, Genevieve arrived. I hadn't been warned. Joel had told me she might stop by at some point, but the framing had been vague enough that I hadn't expected it to mean a Thursday afternoon with a casserole and Cedric in the passenger seat of her car. I opened the front door, and there they both were, and Genevieve was smiling the smile of a woman who had decided that showing up in person was more effective than telephone negotiations. She came inside. She put the casserole on the counter. She and I sat down at the kitchen table, and Cedric sat beside her, and he was, and I want to be fair to him here, genuinely uncomfortable. He was looking at the table. He was not the architect of this visit. Genevieve laid out her keys again, but this time with more detail. She had looked into it. The workshop was, maybe 30 square meters? Cedric's car detailing work was done outside, so he'd mainly need indoor space for his supplies, his equipment, his small buffer machine. He wouldn't touch my grandfather's tools. He would install a separate shelving unit on the far wall. He would pay a small rental fee. She threw out a number, $200 a month, and the arrangement would be month to month, cancelable with 30 days notice. She said it like a business proposal. She had prepared it like a business proposal. She was waiting for me to respond to it like a business proposal. I looked at her for a moment. I looked at Cedric, who was still studying the table, and then I felt it again. That stillness, that settling. The feeling of knowing exactly where you are and exactly what you are going to do. I said, Genevieve, I want to make sure we're all on the same page about something, and I think it's better to do it now while the three of us are here. My voice was calm. I was a little surprised by how calm it was. I said, that workshop is not a rental space. It is not a commercial unit available for subletting. It belongs to me, not to my household, not to my marriage, not to this family collectively, to me, specifically, because my grandfather made a legal decision to put my name on the deed of that building and its contents, and he made that decision after 41 years of knowing me and 31 years of working beside me in that space. That decision was not made casually. He was in the hospital. He had the lucidity to call his notary, review the documents, and hand me the keys himself. That is not the kind of decision that becomes negotiable because someone needs a favor. Genevieve started to say something about family. I said I wasn't finished. I said, I understand that Cedric is in a difficult position, and I have genuine sympathy for that. I have no hostility toward him as a person. But the workshop is not the solution to his situation, and I am not in a position to make it the solution, because it is not mine to repurpose. My grandfather's tools are in that building. His workbench is in that building. The cabinet he built with his own hands the year my mother was born is in that building. And I will not fill that space with automotive chemicals and buffer machines and a month-to-month arrangement that will be very difficult to unwind once it's established, because I know how these things go, and I know that 30 days notice has a way of becoming a conversation, and the conversation has a way of becoming an argument, and I am not willing to put my grandfather's workshop in the middle of that. Cedric said quietly, I didn't know it meant that much. I looked at him. I said, I know you didn't. That's not your fault. Genevieve was quiet. Not the quiet of someone thinking. The quiet of someone recalibrating. I'd seen it before, on a smaller scale, in negotiations with difficult stakeholders at work. The moment when someone realizes the landscape is not what they thought it was. I got up. I went to the drawer beside the fridge where I kept documents. I had the notarized transfer agreement in a folder there. I kept a copy at home, and the original was with my notary in Trois-Rivières. I brought it to the table. I opened it to the page that listed the property description and the transferee. I set it in front of Genevieve without a word. She looked at it. She read it. Her expression didn't collapse dramatically. She wasn't that kind of woman. But something behind it shifted. The proposal she had prepared, the business case she had built, rested on an assumption that the workshop was a household asset, something that existed in the shared territory of Joel's and my life together. The document clarified that it did not. It existed in a category that preceded my marriage and that my marriage had no claim over. She looked up at me. I said, Cedric is welcome here. He is welcome at family dinners, at holidays, at anything we do together. I have no interest in creating distance. But the workshop is mine, and this conversation is finished. She nodded once, slowly. Cedric said he was sorry for the trouble. I told him genuinely that I hoped he found a good solution and that I meant that. They left about 20 minutes later, after Genevieve had recovered enough composure to make the exit graceful. She didn't leave angry. What she left with was something more like the careful posture of a person who has had to revise a mental map they were fairly confident in. Joel came home that evening and I told him what had happened. I told him all of it, in order, calmly. He listened. He didn't interrupt. When I was done, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, I should have told her the workshop wasn't an option. That should have come from me. I said, yes. He said, I kept thinking there was a way to make it work that I hadn't thought of yet. I said, I know, but there wasn't. And waiting for a solution that didn't exist meant your mother showed up at my door with a casserole and a rental proposal. He said he knew that now. I told him knowing it now was where we had to start. What followed was not easy, but it was real. Joel had a pattern, I think he'd had it long before he met me, of absorbing family pressure and redirecting it toward whoever was the most likely to yield. I was usually the most likely to yield. I had been in small ways for the first 2 years of our marriage, and I hadn't even fully noticed until this happened, and I saw the pattern clearly for the first time. We talked about it. Not in one conversation, in many conversations, over several weeks, with the kind of sustained honesty that is uncomfortable in the way that necessary things always are. Joel called Cedric a few days later. He helped him find a listing for a shared commercial unit in Laval. A small workshop co-op where people rented time and space by the month, specifically set up for small trades businesses. It cost more than $200. Joel helped him with the first 2 months. That was the right kind of help. Direct, practical, coming from the right person. Genevieve and I found our way to a kind of equilibrium. It wasn't warm, not at first, but it was honest, which I had come to understand was more durable than warmth that performs itself over the surface of an unresolved thing. She stopped treating me like a resource to be managed. I stopped waiting for the next proposal. We met in the middle somewhere around the following spring, at a dinner at Joel's parents' place, when she asked me about the cabinet I was building and actually listened to the answer. I finished the cabinet that November. It has hand-cut mortise and tenon joints, a frame and panel construction in quarter-sawn white oak, and it sits in the corner of my grandfather's workshop where his old wooden toolbox used to be. I think he would have found things to critique about it. He would have pointed out the one joint on the lower left that is very slightly off square, because he would have noticed it, and he would have thought I should know that he noticed. But I think he also would have stood back and looked at it for a long moment, the way he looked at things that had been made carefully, and he would have said nothing, which was his highest praise. The workshop still smells like sawdust and linseed oil. The keys are on my key ring, where they have always been. And when I unlock that door on Saturday mornings, I still feel something that I can't quite name, something that exists only in places where the time of the people who built them has soaked into the walls and stayed there. My grandfather's 41 years are in that room. I know exactly where they are. And they are not going anywhere.